What could make a room full of society's elite fall completely silent? The grand ballroom of Rosewood Manor held its breath as Grace Holloway's weathered hands trembled above the ivory keys. The woman in the simple gray uniform, the cleaning woman who'd spent the evening invisible, wiping champagne flutes and collecting discarded programs, now sat at the Steinway concert grand, her fingers poised over an instrument worth more than she'd earn in 5 years. Around her, 200 of Connecticut's wealthiest patrons froze mid-whisper. Phone cameras that moments ago had been raised in mockery now waited uncertain. The woman who'd challenged her, the socialite Celeste Beaumont, stood rigid near the front row, her pearl necklace catching the chandelier light as her confident smile began to waver. How did a cleaning woman end up here? And what happened next? But what unfolded in the next 10 minutes would shatter every assumption in that gilded room and expose a truth about talent, prejudice, and the price of grief that no one, not the philanthropists, not the musicians, not even the distinguished Maestro Lawrence Bradford himself, saw coming. This is that story. 8 hours earlier, Grace Holloway had arrived at Rosewood Manor through the service entrance, as she always did. The sprawling estate sat on 12 acres of manicured Connecticut countryside, its limestone facade glowing amber in the late April sunset. Grace carried her cleaning supplies in a weathered canvas bag, her uniform pressed but faded from countless washings. At 57 years old, she moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd learned to take up as little space as possible in the world. The spring air carried the scent of blooming magnolias as she made her way through the servants' corridor, a route she'd walked dozens of times over the past 3 years. Rosewood Manor hosted charity events monthly, and Grace was part of the regular cleaning crew, reliable, invisible, and never asking questions. Tonight was the annual spring piano recital, benefiting the Hartford Arts Foundation. The event drew Connecticut's social elite, old money families, tech entrepreneurs, politicians, and patrons of the arts who wrote checks with more zeros than Grace saw in a year's salary. She'd requested this shift specifically, though she'd told no one why. The Manor's main ballroom was a cathedral of wealth. Crystal chandeliers descended from 20-foot ceilings like frozen waterfalls. Gilded molding traced the walls, and arched windows overlooked gardens where peacocks wandered freely. At the room's heart sat the evening's centerpiece, a magnificent Steinway Model D concert grand, its black lacquer surface reflecting the chandelier light like still water. Grace paused when she saw it, just for a moment. Her fingers flexed involuntarily at her sides before she caught herself and continued to the supply closet. Some memories lived in the body even when the mind tried to forget. By 7 p.m., the ballroom hummed with the particular frequency of money and influence mixing freely. Women glittered in evening gowns that cost more than Grace's monthly rent, their jewelry catching light with every gesture. Men in tuxedos discussed portfolios and political campaigns, champagne flutes serving as punctuation to their conversations. Waiters circulated with hors d'oeuvres that Grace knew cost $50 per bite. She'd overheard the catering manager's invoice discussion that afternoon. Grace worked the periphery, collecting empty glasses, straightening chairs, remaining unseen. It was a skill she'd perfected over 15 years, the art of existing without being noticed. She'd learned that invisible people heard everything and were held accountable for nothing. The evening's program featured 12 amateur pianists from the community, each having paid $5,000 for the privilege of performing before this distinguished audience. The real draw was Maestro Lawrence Bradford, the retired conductor of the Hartford Symphony Orchestra, who would provide commentary and select one performer for a full scholarship to the prestigious Bradford Conservatory. At 72, Maestro Bradford remained a commanding presence, silver-haired ramrod straight, with the kind of old-world elegance that made people unconsciously sit up straighter when he entered a room. He'd trained at Juilliard in the 60s, conducted in Vienna and London, and was responsible for discovering some of America's finest classical musicians over his 5-decade career. Grace had seen him arrive earlier, greeting guests with gracious nods. She'd kept her head down, focusing intently on wiping an already clean table. Her heart had hammered so loudly she was certain others could hear it. He didn't recognize her. Why would he? It had been 25 years, and she'd been someone else entirely back then. Among the evening's performers, one woman demanded attention the way others demanded oxygen. Celeste Beaumont swept through the ballroom like she owned it, which in a sense her family practically did. The Beaumonts had been Connecticut aristocracy for 6 generations, their name appearing on hospital wings, university buildings, and museum galleries throughout the Northeast. At 38, Celeste had never worked a day in her life, but sat on the boards of a dozen charitable organizations, using philanthropy the way others used social media as a platform for visibility and validation. She wore a burgundy silk gown that probably cost more than Grace's car, her blonde hair swept into an elegant chignon that had required a stylist's house call. Diamond earrings caught the light with her every movement, and her laugh, high, crystalline, and slightly too loud, carried across the ballroom like a claim of territory. Celeste was tonight's featured performer, scheduled to close the amateur portion of the recital. She'd been taking piano lessons for 3 years and spoke about her artistic journey to anyone who would listen. Grace first encountered her near the coat check where Celeste was holding court with a group of admirers. Grace had been collecting champagne flutes from a side table when Celeste's voice cut through the ambient conversation. "Careful with those glasses. They're baccarat crystal worth more than your entire month's salary." Grace looked up. Celeste was watching her with the kind of casual assessment one might give a piece of furniture, noting its presence, but not its humanity. "Yes, ma'am," Grace said quietly, continuing her work. "See that you are careful." Celeste turned back to her audience, her next words clearly intended for Grace to hear. "It's so difficult to find quality help these days. I told the event coordinator we should have hired a more upscale service, but apparently budget constraints." She let the sentence trail off with a delicate shrug. A few of her companions laughed. Others looked uncomfortable, but said nothing. Grace felt the familiar heat rise in her chest. Not anger, exactly. She'd long ago learned to transform anger into something else, something more manageable. Dignity, perhaps. Or simply the determination to remain human in the face of casual cruelty. Mrs. Catherine Whitmore, a silver-haired woman in her 70s standing slightly apart from Celeste's group, caught Grace's eye and offered a small apologetic smile. Grace nodded back slightly, then moved on with her work. But as she collected glasses, Grace's gaze drifted as it had been drifting all evening to the Steinway at the room's center. The piano sat on a raised platform, spotlit like a shrine. Its presence pulled at something deep in Grace's chest, something she'd spent 15 years trying to bury. The familiar shape of it, the way the light caught the curve of the lid, the black and white keys that represented infinite possibility, it all whispered memories she'd promised herself she'd never revisit. Her right hand trembled slightly as she gripped the tray of glasses. Mrs. Whitmore noticed. Their eyes met again, and this time the older woman's expression held something more than apology. Curiosity, perhaps, or recognition of something unspoken. But the moment passed. Grace returned to the service corridor, steadied her breathing, and reminded herself why she'd come. Tonight was April 23rd. 15 years ago, on this date, her daughter Maya had turned 7. They'd celebrated with chocolate cake and a trip to hear the Hartford Symphony perform. Maya had sat in the concert hall, transfixed, her small hand gripping Grace's as the music washed over them. "Mama," she'd whispered, "when I grow up, I want to make people feel like this." 3 months later, Maya was gone. Grace closed her eyes, leaning against the cool wall of the service corridor. She'd come tonight to feel close to that memory, to be in a space where music lived and breathed. She'd known there would be piano performances. She'd thought she could handle simply listening, being nearby without participating. She'd been wrong about many things in her life, but this assumption would prove the most consequential. Because in less than 2 hours, Grace Holloway would sit at that Steinway, and nothing, not for her, not for Celeste Beaumont, not for anyone in that ballroom, would ever be quite the same again. The recital began promptly at 8 p.m. with Maestro Bradford offering opening remarks about the power of amateur artistry and the importance of supporting the arts in the community. Grace stood at the back of the ballroom near the service entrance, watching as the first performer, a nervous accountant in his 50s, approached the piano. His rendition of Beethoven's Für Elise was competent, if uninspired, his fingers occasionally stumbling over the familiar passages. Polite applause followed. Then came a college student performing Debussy, a retired teacher attempting Chopin, a young lawyer tackling Rachmaninoff with more enthusiasm than skill. Between performances, Grace moved through the room like a ghost, refreshing water glasses, removing empty champagne flutes, straightening the programs that guests had discarded on tables. She'd perfected the art of hearing without listening, of being present, without existing. But Celeste Beaumont made herself impossible to ignore. During the 4th performance, Celeste's voice rose above the amateur pianist's interpretation of Schubert. She wasn't even trying to whisper. "This is painful," she announced to her companions. "Absolutely painful. Why do these people insist on embarrassing themselves publicly? Some of us have actually trained. You know, some of us take music seriously." Her group murmured agreement, though Grace noticed Mrs. Whitmore had quietly distanced herself, moving to a different table. Grace was removing empty glasses from near Celeste's table when the socialite's attention suddenly fixed on her. "You there? Cleaning woman." Celeste's voice had the sharp clarity of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This table is filthy. Absolutely disgusting. Do your job properly." Grace looked at the table. It was spotless. She'd cleaned it herself 20 minutes ago. "Yes, ma'am. I'll clean it again." Grace pulled out her cloth. "And while you're at it, explain to me how someone manages to do such a poor job at something so simple." Celeste had fully turned, now her diamond earrings catching light as she tilted her head. Surely wiping a table doesn't require advanced education. A few guests laughed. Others found sudden interest in their programs. Grace wiped the already clean table in silence, her weathered hands moving in slow, deliberate circles. "Perhaps she's mentally deficient." Celeste continued, her voice carrying easily across nearby tables. "Is that it? Do you struggle with basic instructions?" "Should I speak more slowly, Celeste?" Mrs. Whitmore's voice cut across the space, sharp despite its age. "That's quite enough." "Oh, Catherine, don't be such a bleeding heart. I'm simply pointing out that standards have declined terribly. Look at her hands, absolutely ruined. Those are the hands of someone who's spent their life in manual labor. No refinement, no care for personal presentation." Grace's hands stilled on the table. In the spotlights reflecting off the crystal water glasses, her hands did look weathered, calloused, the nails short and practical, the skin dry, despite the lotion she applied nightly. They were the hands of a woman who'd spent 15 years scrubbing floors, washing dishes, and trying to work hard enough to outrun her memories. But they were also hands that had once coaxed miracles from piano keys, hands that had performed at Carnegie Hall, hands that had been photographed for classical music magazines. Celeste couldn't see that history. No one could. And that was exactly how Grace had wanted it for 15 years. "My apologies, ma'am," Grace said quietly. "The table is clean now." She moved away, but not before catching Mrs. Whitmore's expression. The older woman was studying Grace with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. There was recognition there, but of what Grace couldn't determine. As Grace returned to the service corridor, a young waitress named Carmen touched her arm sympathetically. "Don't let her get to you," Carmen whispered. "She's horrible to everyone. Last month she made one of the caterers cry because his tray wasn't level enough." Grace managed a small smile. "I've dealt with worse." And she had. 15 years ago, when the police had knocked on her door with news that turned her world inside out. When she'd sat in a hospital corridor and learned that her daughter, her brilliant, beautiful, music-loving daughter, hadn't survived the accident. When she'd looked at her hands on the steering wheel and realized that some mistakes can never be undone, no matter how much skill or talent or training you possess. Compared to that, Celeste Beaumont's cruelty was merely weather unpleasant, but survivable. But Grace carried something those guests could never understand, a history that would soon rewrite everything they believed about worth and talent. The amateur performances continued with varying degrees of competence. A surgeon performed Brahms with technical precision, but no emotional depth. Twin sisters played a four-hand arrangement of Mozart that was charming, if slightly chaotic. A grandmother in her 80s tackled Liszt with such earnest determination that the audience applauded more for her courage than her execution. Through it all, Maestro Bradford listened with the patient attention of someone who'd spent decades evaluating musical potential. He offered kind words to each performer, finding something praiseworthy in even the most challenged attempts. Grace watched from the shadows, her professional responsibilities temporarily forgotten. Despite everything, despite all the years she'd spent running from music, she couldn't help analyzing each performance, noting the rushed tempo. Here, the missed dynamics; there, the places where technical ability failed to serve emotional truth. It was like breathing. Even after 15 years, she couldn't stop hearing music the way she'd been trained to hear it. Then Celeste Beaumont's name was announced, and the ballroom's energy shifted. Celeste rose with practiced grace, acknowledging the scattered applause with a modest smile that didn't reach her eyes. She'd changed during intermission into an even more elaborate gown, this one pale gold, and clearly chosen to complement the piano's spotlight. She settled at the Steinway with an air of ownership, adjusting the bench with theatrical precision. The murmur of conversation died away. "I'll be performing Chopin's Waltz in D-flat Major Opus 64, Number 1 Celeste," announced her voice carrying clearly. Also known as the Minute Waltz, though of course it takes longer than a minute to perform properly. A ripple of laughter from her admirers. Grace's hands tightened on the tray she was holding. The Minute Waltz. She knew this piece intimately, had performed it dozens of times, including at her debut recital at the New England Conservatory 28 years ago. Celeste began to play. The notes came out technically correct, but emotionally hollow, like someone reciting a speech they'd memorized without understanding. Her fingers moved through the familiar patterns with adequate precision, hitting the right keys in mostly the right order. But there was no poetry in it. No sense of the playful lightness that Chopin had intended, no understanding that the piece was supposed to capture the image of a small dog chasing its tail. It was music processed through a mechanical understanding, correct, but soulless. Grace could hear every place where Celeste rushed the tempo, every dynamic that should have been pianissimo, but came out merely piano, every phrase that should have breathed, but instead lay flat on the air like week-old flowers. Around the ballroom, guests applauded politely between movements. Celeste's admirers offered exaggerated praise. Wonderful, magnificent, such talent. But Maestro Bradford's expression remained carefully neutral. Grace, watching from the shadows, saw what others missed, the way his fingers drummed slightly against his knee, marking the correct tempo that Celeste wasn't maintaining. The way his eyebrows drew together during the sections where her interpretation faltered. He was too professional to show disappointment openly, but Grace recognized the look. She'd seen it before, 25 years ago, in his studio at the conservatory, when a student failed to grasp a piece's deeper meaning. Celeste finished with a flourish, her hands rising from the keys in a gesture that was more theatrical than musical. The applause was enthusiastic more for Celeste's social position than her performance, but Grace noticed that Maestro Bradford's clapping was perfunctory at best. Adequate technique, he offered when asked for comment. With more attention to dynamics and phrasing, Miss Beaumont could develop into a competent amateur pianist. The compliment was so faint it was nearly an insult, but Celeste chose to hear only the word competent beaming as she accepted congratulations from her circle. Grace turned away, returning to her work. She'd seen enough. The evening was nearly over, just 2 more amateur performers, then closing remarks. Then she could leave and return to her small apartment, where memories didn't press quite so insistently against her chest. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. The final 2 amateur performers completed their pieces respectably, but unremarkably, and intermission was called. Waiters circulated with a final round of champagne and dessert, while guests mingled and discussed the performances. Grace was collecting empty dessert plates when she heard Celeste's voice rise above the conversation, sharp with irritation. "I don't understand Bradford's comment." "Adequate." "My technique was flawless. He's clearly biased toward more conservative interpretations." Mrs. Whitmore, who'd somehow ended up near Celeste's group again, spoke with the frankness that came with age and inherited wealth. "Bradford's been evaluating pianists for 50 years, dear. If he says your dynamics need work, your dynamics need work." Celeste's face flushed. "Easy for you to say, Catherine. You've never had the courage to perform anything yourself. At least I'm out there taking risks, contributing to the arts, not just writing checks and judging others from the audience." "There's a difference between taking risks and lacking self-awareness," Mrs. Whitmore replied calmly. "True artists understand their limitations. True artists." Celeste's laugh was brittle. "Please. Half these people tonight couldn't play chopsticks properly. The bar is embarrassingly low. I'm probably the only one here with any real training." "Training doesn't guarantee talent," Mrs. Whitmore observed. "And apparently money doesn't guarantee class," Celeste shot back. "Though I suppose you'd know about that, Catherine, given your friendship with the hired help." Grace, who'd been working a few tables away, went very still. Celeste had noticed the exchange between Grace and Mrs. Whitmore earlier. She gestured toward Grace, now her diamond bracelet catching light. "I mean, look at her. Does she even know what a piano sounds like? Can she even read music, or is that beyond her educational level?" Grace kept her eyes on the plates she was stacking, her face carefully neutral. But Mrs. Whitmore had had enough. "Actually, Celeste, I'd wager the cleaning woman probably has a more refined understanding of music than you do." The comment landed like a slap. Celeste's eyes widened, then narrowed. Around them, conversation had begun to quiet as guests sensed conflict. "Is that so?" Celeste's voice dripped with false sweetness. Well, then perhaps we should test that theory. Perhaps our cleaning woman should demonstrate her refined understanding for all of us. Celeste. Don't be ridiculous, Mrs. Whitmore began. But Celeste was already moving toward Grace, her heels clicking against the marble floor with the staccato rhythm of warfare. You there, cleaning woman. Celeste's voice rang out clearly, designed to draw attention. Mrs. Whitmore here believes you have a refined understanding of music. Is that true? Do you play piano? Grace looked up slowly. Every instinct screamed at her to demur, to deflect, to remain invisible as she'd been for 15 years. I know a little about music, ma'am, she said quietly. A little Celeste turned to address the growing crowd of onlookers. She knows a little. How marvelous. Well, since the maestro seemed so unimpressed with my adequate performance, perhaps he'd be more inspired by someone with a refined understanding. What do you say, everyone? Shall we have a little entertainment? Let's see the cleaning woman play Celeste. This is inappropriate, Mrs. Whitmore stepped forward. Oh, come now, Catherine. You started this. You claimed she understood music better than I do. Let her prove it. Celeste turned back to Grace, her smile sharp as a blade. Unless, of course, you were speaking out of turn. Unless you actually know nothing about music and Mrs. Whitmore was simply being charitable to make a point. The ballroom had gone quiet now. 200 faces turned toward Grace, some curious, some uncomfortable, some openly anticipating humiliation. Grace felt the weight of their attention like a physical pressure. Her heart hammered against her ribs. 15 years. 15 years she'd successfully avoided this exact situation, avoided any context where her past might surface. She could leave, should leave. Apologize for the confusion, return to the service corridor, finish her shift, and disappear back into the anonymous life she'd built. But then her eyes found the Steinway spotlit on its platform. And she thought of Maya, who'd be 22 now, if that rainy night 15 years ago had gone differently. Maya, who'd loved Chopin and Beethoven, and had begged for piano lessons starting at age 4. Maya, who used to sit in Grace's lap as she practiced tiny fingers trying to mimic the movements. Maya, whose 7th birthday had fallen on this date, and who should have been here alive pursuing her own musical dreams. Grace had come tonight to feel close to that memory. She'd thought proximity to music would be enough, but maybe, just maybe, memory demanded more than proximity. Maybe it demanded courage. Grace set down her tray of dishes. Her hands were trembling, but she met Celeste's eyes steadily. If the maestro permits it, Grace said quietly, I'll play. The ballroom erupted in whispers. Celeste's triumphant smile widened. This was even better than she'd hoped. Public humiliation would be so much more satisfying than a simple verbal surrender. Maestro Bradford, who'd been conversing with donors near the front, turned at the commotion. His silver eyebrows rose as the situation was quickly explained to him by excited guests. Most irregular, he murmured, but curiosity flickered in his eyes. However, if the lady wishes to play, I see no harm, though perhaps something brief would be appropriate. Oh, let her play whatever she likes, Celeste said generously, gesturing toward the Steinway, like a queen granting permission to approach the throne. This should be enlightening. Grace walked toward the platform, and with each step she felt 15 years of carefully constructed invisibility falling away like shed skin. Her hands trembled at her sides. Not from nervousness about playing, muscle memory didn't forget even after 15 years of silence, but from everything playing represented, every memory she'd locked away, every moment of joy that had been tainted by guilt, every note that reminded her of what she'd lost. Maya's face flashed in her mind, Not as she'd last seen her broken unconscious surrounded by beeping machines in the ICU, but as she'd been that final morning grinning over breakfast, excited about the school concert that afternoon. "Mama, will you help me practice one more time before school?" Grace had been running late for a meeting with her agent. A recording contract was being discussed. Her career was at a critical juncture. "Tonight, baby," she'd promised. "We'll practice tonight and you'll be perfect for tomorrow's concert." But tonight had never come. Grace had lost track of time in the meeting. The school had called when she didn't show up for pickup. She'd driven too fast, distracted trying to return frantic calls. The rain had been heavier than predicted. The truck had run the red light, but Grace's reaction time, compromised by fatigue and stress, had been too slow. The accident wasn't ruled her fault, but Grace knew the truth. If she'd kept her promise that morning, practiced with Maya at breakfast, instead of prioritizing her career, she wouldn't have been running late, wouldn't have been driving distracted, wouldn't have had her daughter in the car at that exact moment when the truck ran the light. The piano had taken Maya from her. Not directly, perhaps, but the career, the ambition, the endless hours of practice that had seemed so important, all of it had created the circumstances that led to that rainy intersection. So Grace had quit, walked away completely, changed her name back to her maiden name, Holloway, abandoning the hyphenated Holloway Chen she'd used professionally, sold the piano that had sat in their living room, took jobs that kept her hands busy with mindless work that couldn't hurt anyone. And for 15 years, she'd successfully avoided music. Until tonight. Grace reached the platform steps. Her legs felt unsteady, but she forced them to carry her forward. Behind her, she could hear the whispers, amused, curious, anticipatory of disaster. Only Mrs. Whitmore's voice carried clearly. "Grace." Grace turned. The older woman had somehow learned her name, probably from the cleaning service roster, and her eyes held something that looked like understanding. "You don't have to do this," Mrs. Whitmore said softly. But Grace realized she did. Not for Celeste, not for the audience, not even to prove anything. For Maya, who'd loved music more than anything, who'd wanted to make people feel the way symphonies made her feel, who'd never gotten the chance to sit at a stage piano and share her gift with the world. Grace would play for Maya. One last time she'd play for her daughter. "Thank you, Grace," said to Mrs. Whitmore, "but I need to." She climbed the 3 steps to the platform. The spotlight seemed brighter from up here, more exposing. Grace could feel 200 pairs of eyes tracking her movements as she crossed to the Steinway. Her reflection caught in the piano's glossy black surface a woman in a gray cleaning uniform, her dark skin showing the wear of hard years, her hair pulled back in a practical bun with gray threading through the black. She looked every one of her 57 years, and then some. She looked nothing like the woman who'd performed at Carnegie Hall 28 years ago, fresh from the New England Conservatory, being hailed as one of the most promising young pianists of her generation. But her hands, her weathered, calloused, practical hands, remembered. Grace sat on the bench, adjusting it slightly. The familiar action sent muscle memory cascading through her body. How many thousands of times had she made this exact adjustment in practice rooms, on concert stages, at home, with Maya perched beside her? Phone cameras were raised throughout the audience. Grace could see guests recording, no doubt expecting to capture a viral moment of public humiliation. Celeste stood near the front, arms crossed, her smile, anticipating vindication. Only Maestro Bradford's expression was unreadable. He'd moved closer to the stage, his head tilted slightly in an attitude of focused attention that Grace recognized. He was listening not with his expectations, but with his trained ear. Grace closed her eyes, letting her hands rest on her lap for a moment. The ballroom had gone completely silent. Not the respectful silence that had preceded other performances, but the breathless hush before an expected disaster. "What will you play?" Maestro Bradford's voice cut through the quiet kind, but curious. Grace opened her eyes. She looked directly at him, and for just a moment something flickered in his expression. Confusion, perhaps, or the ghost of recognition that hadn't quite crystallized. "Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor," Grace said quietly. "Posthumous." Gasps rippled through the audience. Even amateur music lovers recognized this as one of Chopin's most technically and emotionally demanding pieces. It was a work that professional pianists prepared for months, that required both flawless technique and profound emotional depth. "That's quite ambitious," Maestro Bradford said carefully. "Are you certain?" "Yes, Maestro." Celeste's laugh rang out sharp and delighted. "Oh, this is perfect! She's actually going to attempt one of the most difficult Chopin pieces. This is better than I could have imagined." Grace turned back to the piano. Her hands moved to the keys, hovering just above them. The ivory felt cool beneath her fingertips, familiar, despite the years of separation. "This is for my daughter," Grace said softly, though her voice carried in the silent room. "Maya, who would have been 22 today? Who loved this piece more than anything? Baby girl, this one's for you." The words shifted something in the atmosphere. The anticipation of mockery tempered slightly with confusion, curiosity a hint of something more complicated. Grace's fingers descended to the keys, and the world changed. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor emerged from the Steinway like a secret being whispered into existence. Not played, not performed, released. The opening phrase, "delicate, melancholic, impossibly tender," filled the ballroom with a quality of sound that made the previous performances seem like rough sketches compared to a master painting. This wasn't someone playing notes. This was someone speaking directly through music, translating emotion into sound with a fluency that transcended technical skill. Within the first 8 measures, everything changed. Celeste's smug expression froze, then slowly crumbled. Her mouth opened slightly, her eyes widening with an emotion somewhere between shock and disbelief. Throughout the ballroom, phone cameras that had been raised to capture humiliation now recorded in stunned silence. Guests who'd been leaning back in their chairs preparing to laugh sat forward, arrested by the impossible beauty cascading from the platform. Mrs. Whitmore's eyes filled with tears, and Maestro Lawrence Bradford went absolutely still, his face draining of color. Because he knew this playing. He knew it the way you know a voice you haven't heard in decades, but would recognize anywhere. The technique was flawless, every trill perfectly executed, every dynamic subtlety precisely controlled, every phrase shaped with the kind of musical intelligence that couldn't be faked or learned from YouTube tutorials. But technical perfection was merely the foundation. Above it, Grace built cathedrals of emotion. The Nocturne's opening section spoke of loss, not the dramatic, operatic loss of grand tragedy, but the quiet, persistent ache of absence, of empty chairs at breakfast tables, of lullabies sung to no one, of holidays marked by silence where laughter should have been. Grace's hands moved across the keys with the confidence of someone who'd lived inside this music, who understood Chopin's notation not as instructions to be followed, but as a language to be spoken. The middle section arrived technically treacherous, requiring the left hand to maintain steady bass notes, while the right hand navigated rapid chromatic runs. Grace executed it with such ease that the difficulty became invisible, the way true mastery always makes the impossible look effortless. But it was the emotional content that devastated the audience. Each phrase told a story. The rising progressions spoke of hope, tentative and fragile. The descending passages carried regret heavy, but somehow also beautiful. The moments of dissonance held truth, the acknowledgement that some losses never fully resolve, that some griefs become part of who you are rather than something you overcome. This was music played by someone who understood pain intimately, who'd transformed suffering into something transcendent. Tears streamed down Grace's face as she played, but her hands never faltered. Every note landed exactly where it needed to be. Every phrase breathed with the natural rhythm of someone who'd spent decades understanding how music should move through time. In the audience, dozens were crying now, not from sadness exactly, but from the recognition that they were witnessing something extraordinary, something that reminded them why humans created music in the first place, to give voice to emotions too deep, for words to create beauty from heartbreak, to prove that survival itself could be a form of art. Maestro Bradford's hand had moved to his chest, fingers pressed over his heart, as if trying to contain whatever was breaking open inside him. Because he finally recognized what his ears had known from the first phrase. He knew these hands, knew this musical voice, knew the distinctive way this pianist approached phrasing, the slight pause before cadences that created suspended anticipation, the way forte passages emerged from pianissimo, like inevitabilities rather than surprises. 25 years ago, he'd trained a student who played exactly like this. A brilliant young woman who'd reminded him of Horowitz in her technical command and Martha Argerich in her emotional fearlessness. He'd predicted she would become one of the great pianists of her generation. Her name had been Grace Holloway Chen. She'd disappeared from the music world suddenly without explanation. He'd tried to find her, had called her home number dozens of times, only to find it disconnected. Her agent had known nothing. She'd simply vanished, leaving a promising career and a recording contract behind. And here she was, wearing a cleaning uniform, playing Chopin at a charity event for amateur pianists, playing as magnificently as she had 25 years ago, perhaps more so with the added depth that only suffering could provide. The Nocturne's recapitulation arrived, the opening theme returning, transformed by everything that had come before. What had been melancholic in the first statement now carried acceptance, even a kind of peace. Grace shaped the phrases with infinite tenderness, each note a prayer or a promise. The music spoke of love that transcended loss of memory, that honored rather than tortured of a mother's devotion, that death itself couldn't diminish. The final measures approached the descending progression that would end the piece. Grace slowed imperceptibly, letting each note resonate fully before moving to the next, stretching time itself, until the boundary between music and silence became indistinct. The last chord, C-sharp minor, resolving to C-sharp major darkness, giving way to light, hung in the air like a benediction. Grace's hands lifted from the keys, and for 10 full seconds, the ballroom of Rosewood Manor held its breath in absolute perfect silence. The silence following the final chord stretched like glass about to shatter. Grace sat motionless at the piano, her eyes still closed, tears tracking lines down her dark cheeks. Her chest rose and fell with deep breaths, as if she'd just surfaced from deep water after being submerged too long. In the audience, 200 people remained frozen in a collective moment of recognition that they'd just witnessed something far beyond the amateur recital they'd expected. This hadn't been a performance. This had been a revelation. Mrs. Whitmore had both hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming freely. The guests who'd laughed at Celeste's mockery sat stunned and ashamed. Even the waitstaff had stopped moving, stood along the ballroom's edges with serving trays forgotten. And Celeste Beaumont, who minutes ago had been triumphant, certain of imminent vindication, stood with her face drained of color, her carefully applied makeup tracking down her cheeks with her tears, her entire body trembling with the sudden devastating understanding of how small she actually was. Maestro Lawrence Bradford moved first. He stepped forward, his distinguished composure cracking as his face contorted with emotion. His hands, which had conducted the Hartford Symphony Orchestra for 3 decades, which had led performances at Carnegie Hall and the Vienna Staatsoper, shook as he raised them. And then he began to clap. The sound broke the spell. Like a dam bursting, the entire ballroom erupted. Applause thundered through the space. Not the polite, appreciative applause that had followed previous performances, but the kind of ovation that shakes the walls. People rose to their feet in a wave, the standing ovation spontaneous and universal. "Brava," someone shouted. Then others joined. "Brava! Brava!" Phone cameras were recording now, not for mockery, but for history. Guests instinctively understanding they needed to capture this moment to have proof that they'd been here when something extraordinary happened. Grace opened her eyes slowly, as if returning from a great distance. She looked out at the standing crowd, seeming almost surprised to find herself back in the present, in this ballroom, in this moment. Her gaze found Maestro Bradford first, and she saw recognition blazing in his eyes. "Grace?" Maestro Bradford's voice cut through the applause, amplified by the room's acoustics, but also by the raw emotion in it. "Grace Holloway." The applause began to falter as guests sensed another layer to this story unfolding before them. Grace stood slowly from the piano bench, her legs unsteady. She gripped the Steinway's edge for support. "Hello, Maestro," she said quietly. Bradford climbed the 3 steps to the platform with more speed than his 72 years should have allowed. He crossed to her in 4 quick strides, stopping just short of embracing her, his hands reaching out, then falling back, unsure of permission. "My God," he breathed. "My God, Grace. I thought we all thought you'd left the country, or worse. I tried to find you. I called for months. Your agent had no information. You just vanished." "I know," Grace said softly. "I'm sorry." "Sorry." Bradford's voice cracked. "You were the most gifted student I ever taught. You had a recording contract with Deutsche Grammophon. You were scheduled to perform the Rachmaninoff Third with the Boston Symphony. You were..." He paused, struggling for composure. "What happened?" "Grace, where have you been?" The ballroom had gone silent again. Every guest straining to hear this exchange. Grace looked down at her hands, the hands that had just created impossible beauty, the hands that Celeste had mocked hours ago as ruined and coarse. "I had a daughter." Grace began, her voice steady, despite the tears still wet on her face. "Maya. She was 7 years old. Smart as a whip, loved music more than anything. She wanted to be a pianist like me." Grace paused, drawing breath. 15 years ago, tonight was her 7th birthday. 3 months later, there was an accident. A rainy night, an intersection, a truck that ran a red light. I was driving. We were rushing home from my practice session that had run late. I was distracted, tired. The ballroom seemed to lean in collectively, holding its breath. Maya died 2 days later. In the ICU, Grace continued, her voice carrying clearly now as if speaking these words aloud for the first time in years was its own kind of performance. The accident wasn't ruled my fault, the truck driver was found at fault. But I knew the truth. If I'd been more present, less consumed by my career, more focused on being a mother instead of being a pianist, I might have reacted faster, might have avoided the intersection entirely if I'd left earlier. "Grace." Bradford's voice was barely a whisper. I couldn't play anymore, maestro. Every note reminded me of what I'd lost, of what my ambition had cost. So I quit. Walked away from everything, the contract, the career, the identity. I changed back to my maiden name. I took jobs that kept my hands busy with work that couldn't hurt anyone. She looked around the ballroom. For 15 years, I've cleaned buildings and washed dishes and tried to be invisible. Because visible Grace pianist, Grace ambitious Grace, that Grace had killed her daughter. Number. Mrs. Whitmore's voice rang out from the audience, sharp and clear. The elderly woman had moved to the front row, and she climbed the steps to the platform now with surprising agility. "No, Grace. An accident killed your daughter. Grief and guilt have poisoned your perspective, but those emotions don't change facts. You didn't kill your child. A terrible random tragedy did." "Mrs. Whitmore is right," Bradford added his hands, finally reaching out to grip Grace's shoulders. "Grace, what happened was unbearable, but it wasn't your fault. And to punish yourself by hiding this," he gestured at the piano, at the lingering resonance of the Nocturne still hanging in the air, this extraordinary gift for 15 years. Maya wouldn't have wanted that. Grace's composure finally broke. A sob escaped her, then another. Bradford pulled her into an embrace, and she collapsed against him. 15 years of grief and guilt and loss, finally finding release. The audience watched in reverent silence as this woman who minutes ago they'd thought was just hired help, who they'd been prepared to laugh at, revealed herself as something far more complex and profound than any of them had imagined. And in the third row, Celeste Beaumont sank into her chair, her face in her hands, her entire body shaking with sobs that had nothing to do with the beauty of the music, and everything to do with the crushing weight of her own cruelty. Bradford held Grace as she wept, and when she finally pulled back, wiping her face with the back of her hand, he gripped her shoulders firmly. "Grace, listen to me. What you just played, that was among the finest performances of that Nocturne I've ever heard, and I've heard Rubinstein play it. I've heard Perahia Ashkenazi, every great interpreter of Chopin alive in my lifetime. What you just did rivals any of them." "It was for Maya," Grace said softly. "Today would have been her 22nd birthday. I came tonight just to be near music again, to feel close to her memory. I never intended to play, but then..." She glanced toward where Celeste sat, then looked away. "Sometimes life gives you permission in unexpected ways." "Permission?" Bradford repeated his tone, gaining strength. "Grace, you don't need anyone's permission to share this gift. You never did. And hiding it, hiding yourself, that's not honoring Maya's memory. That's letting tragedy win twice." He turned to address the ballroom, his conductor's voice carrying easily across the space. "Ladies and gentlemen, I owe you all an explanation. What you just witnessed was not an amateur pianist playing above her skill level. What you witnessed was one of the finest musical talents of her generation, a woman who trained at the New England Conservatory, who performed at Carnegie Hall at age 24, who was being called the heir to Horowitz by critics before she was 30. Gasps rippled through the audience. Phones were now recording, openly capturing every word. Her name is Grace Holloway, and she is one of my greatest students. 25 years ago, she was on the verge of international recognition. And then personal tragedy struck, and she made the devastating choice to walk away from music entirely. For 15 years, she's been living right here in Connecticut, working service jobs, and none of us, not her colleagues, not her fellow musicians, not those of us who trained her, none of us knew. Bradford turned back to Grace. But now we do know. And Grace, you can't put this back in the box. What you just did, that wasn't just muscle memory. That was artistry matured by suffering technique, enhanced by life experience. You're not the pianist you were 25 years ago. You're better. Grace shook her head slowly. Maestro, I can't. You can, he interrupted firmly. And more than that, you must. Because talents like yours don't belong to you alone. They belong to everyone who needs to hear them. Everyone who needs to be reminded that beauty can emerge from loss, that grief doesn't have to be the end of the story, that surviving tragedy can actually deepen artistry rather than destroy it. He paused, letting his words settle. Then, with the authority of someone accustomed to making pronouncements that shaped careers, I want you to teach at the Bradford Conservatory. I want you to perform. I want you to record. Not because I'm trying to force you back into a life you fled, but because what you have, what you've become, that needs to be in the world. Grace stood silent for a long moment, tears still tracking down her face. She looked at the piano, then at Bradford, then at the audience of strangers who'd heard her story. Finally, she spoke. I'll think about it, she said quietly. That's all I can promise right now. I'll think about it. Bradford nodded, understanding that this was as much as she could offer in this moment. That's enough. For now, that's enough. But before Grace could step away from the platform, another voice rang out. Wait, please wait. Celeste Beaumont was standing, her expensive gown creased from sitting, her makeup ruined, her carefully styled hair beginning to come loose from its chignon. She climbed the steps to the platform on unsteady legs, her heels catching slightly on each rise. When she reached Grace, she stopped at a respectful distance, seeming suddenly uncertain of how to proceed. Celeste's voice broke. She tried again. I am so deeply, terribly sorry. The ballroom held its collective breath. What I said to you tonight, what I've said to you for months, every time you've worked these events, it was cruel and unforgivable. I mocked you. I treated you as less than human. Her voice broke completely. I am so ashamed. Not just because I was wrong about who you are, but because it shouldn't have mattered who you were. You deserved dignity and respect regardless of your job or your past or anything else. And I gave you cruelty instead. Celeste's tears fell freely, now unchecked. I can't take back what I said or how I treated you. I can only tell you that I'm sorry, and that hearing you play tonight. She paused, struggling for words. It broke something open in me. Something that needed to break. You showed me what real talent looks like, what real grace looks like. And you showed me exactly who I am when I'm not performing for an audience. What you revealed isn't pretty. Grace regarded Celeste in silence for a moment. Then quietly, Why? Why what? Why were you cruel? You don't know me. I've never done anything to you, so why did you need to hurt me? Celeste's face crumpled further. Because I'm terrified, she whispered. Terrified that without my family's name and money, I'm nobody. That I have no real talents, nothing that makes me special. And seeing you, someone I thought had less than me, I needed you to be lesser to make myself feel more. That's the ugly truth. I was cruel because I'm scared and insecure, and I've never actually earned anything in my life. Grace absorbed this confession, her expression unreadable. Finally, she said, Thank you for the honesty. That took courage. Not courage, Celeste said bitterly. Necessity. After what I just witnessed, after what I just learned, I couldn't live with myself if I didn't at least acknowledge what I'd done. though I understand if you can't forgive me. I don't know if I'd forgive me." Grace was quiet for another long moment. "Then my daughter used to say that everybody's fighting a battle you know nothing about." She was 7, but somehow she understood that already. She was kinder than I ever was. Grace reached out and briefly touched Celeste's arm. Not an embrace, but a moment of connection. "I don't know if I forgive you, not yet. Forgiveness takes time. But I hear you, and I accept your apology. That's the best I can do right now." Celeste nodded, tears streaming down her face. "That's more than I deserve. Thank you." She turned to leave the platform, then paused. "For what it's worth, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever heard, and I'm grateful I was here to hear it, even if I had to become the villain of the story to make it happen." As Celeste descended the stairs, the ballroom began to applaud again. Not for her exactly, but for the moment of truth that had just unfolded, for the rare public reckoning with cruelty and its consequences. Grace stood on the platform, surrounded by the lingering presence of the music she'd created, and for the first time in 15 years, she felt something shift inside her. Not healing exactly. Not yet. But maybe the possibility of it. The recital officially ended, though no one seemed in any hurry to leave. Guests clustered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about what they'd witnessed. The few remaining amateur performers who'd been scheduled to close the program graciously withdrew. No one wanted to follow what Grace had done, and everyone understood that the evening's real conclusion had already occurred. Grace found herself surrounded by people wanting to speak with her, to apologize for their silence during Celeste's mockery, to ask questions about her past, to tell her how the music had affected them. Mrs. Whitmore remained close, running interference, when the attention became overwhelming. "Give her space," the elderly woman said firmly to an overly enthusiastic guest. "She's had enough for one evening." During a brief moment of relative quiet, Grace turned to Mrs. Whitmore. "How did you know what, dear, that I understood music? You defended me to Celeste before you'd heard me play." Mrs. Whitmore smiled slightly. "I didn't know you were a concert pianist, if that's what you're asking, but I've seen you at these events for months. I watched how you looked at the piano, how your fingers moved slightly when others performed marking rhythms you weren't playing, how you positioned yourself to hear the music clearly even while working. I knew you weren't just hired help who happened to be in a room with a piano. I knew music mattered to you. You're very observant." "I'm old and rich and bored," Mrs. Whitmore said with a wry smile. "Observation is my primary entertainment, that and collecting interesting people." Speaking of which, she pulled a card from her small clutch purse. "My personal number. Call me. I'd very much like to continue this conversation when you're not emotionally drained and surrounded by gawkers." Grace accepted the card, touched. "Thank you for defending me tonight, for seeing me. My dear, you're rather difficult not to see, though I understand why you've been trying to be invisible." Mrs. Whitmore squeezed Grace's hand gently. "But invisibility is a prison, not a refuge. I hope you'll consider the maestro's offer. The world needs your music." Across the room, Celeste had been cornered by several guests. Her former admirers now viewing her with expressions ranging from disappointment to open condemnation. "I can't believe you spoke to her that way," one woman said sharply. "Grace Holloway. Do you have any idea who she was in the classical music world I didn't know?" Celeste began. "It shouldn't have mattered." Another guest interrupted. "She could have been nobody and you still would have been wrong to treat her that way. That's the point you're missing." Celeste nodded miserably. "You're right. You're absolutely right." Grace watched this unfold from across the ballroom and felt something complicated, not satisfaction exactly, but a sense that justice was unfolding in its own way. Celeste was experiencing consequences, learning lessons that money and privilege had previously shielded her from learning. Maybe that was its own kind of grace. Maestro Bradford appeared at Grace's elbow, 2 glasses of champagne in hand. He offered her one. "I don't usually drink on the job," Grace said with a small smile. "I don't think you're on the job anymore tonight," Bradford replied. "Consider yourself temporarily promoted from cleaning staff to guest of honor." Grace accepted the glass. The champagne tasted expensive, probably more expensive than anything she typically allowed herself. "I meant what I said, Grace. About the conservatory. About teaching. About performing." Bradford's expression was earnest. "You don't have to decide tonight or even this month, but please truly consider it. What you have, not just the technical skill, but the emotional depth, the life experience, that's what makes great teachers. Students need to learn not just how to play notes, but how to transform suffering into beauty. How to let life deepen artistry rather than destroy it." Grace sipped her champagne, considering. "I'm not the same person I was, Maestro. I've spent 15 years deliberately forgetting everything I knew about being a professional musician. I don't know if I can go back." "I'm not asking you to go back," Bradford said gently. "I'm asking you to go forward, as the person you are now, not the person you were then." And Grace. He paused, making sure she was hearing him. "You're better now. What you played tonight had depths that your younger self couldn't have accessed. Loss matured your artistry. That's not something to run from. That's something to honor." Grace was quiet for a long moment, watching guests slowly begin to depart, the evening finally winding down. "Can I give you my answer in a few weeks?" she asked finally. "Take as long as you need," Bradford said. "I'll be here. The conservatory will be here. And Grace, even if you decide not to teach, at least start playing again. For yourself, if for no one else. For Maya." At the mention of her daughter's name, Grace's throat tightened. She loved music so much. She used to sit in my lap while I practiced trying to reach the keys. She'd make me play the same pieces over and over because she loved hearing them again and again. "Then play for her," Bradford said softly. "Let her love of music live on through you. That's not dwelling in the past. That's honoring her memory by keeping alive what she cherished." Grace nodded, not trusting her voice to speak. As the ballroom began to empty, a small group remained: Mrs. Whitmore, Maestro Bradford, a few guests who seemed genuinely interested in Grace's story, rather than simple gossip gathering. Grace found herself sitting at one of the round tables, still in her gray cleaning uniform, telling the story she'd kept silent for 15 years. "Maya was born when I was 35. Grace began, her voice steady now that the initial emotional storm had passed. Late for a first child, especially for someone with a demanding career. My husband Richard, he was a cellist with the Hartford Symphony. We'd waited until we felt stable enough, established enough. But the truth is, you're never really ready for how completely a child will transform your life." She paused, remembering. Maya was extraordinary. Not because I'm her mother, and biased though I am both those things, but genuinely extraordinary. She had perfect pitch, could hear a melody once and play it back. By age 4, she was begging for piano lessons. By 6, she was composing little pieces, nothing sophisticated, but structurally sound. "She inherited your gift," Mrs. Whitmore observed quietly. "And my obsession with music," Grace said with a sad smile. "That was the problem. I saw myself in her and I pushed. Not cruelly, not overtly, but I had expectations. I wanted her to have the career I had, the opportunities I'd earned. I scheduled her life around lessons and practice and performances. I became my own childhood piano teacher, demanding perfectionist, never satisfied with good enough." Grace's hands tightened on her champagne flute. The week before the accident, we'd argued. She wanted to quit piano and try soccer instead. I said no. Told her she was too talented to waste time on sports, that she had a gift that required dedication. She was 7 years old, and I was trying to plan her entire life. Children need structure, Bradford offered gently. That's not abuse. No, but it's not love either. Not purely. It's love mixed with ambition, with projection, with all my own unresolved issues about achievement and worth. Grace looked down at her hands. The day of the accident, I'd promised to help her practice for her school concert that morning. But I had a meeting with my agent. A recording contract was being discussed, so I told her we'd practice that night instead. Grace. Mrs. Whitmore began, but Grace needed to finish. I was late picking her up from school. The meeting ran long. I was rushing distracted, trying to return phone calls while driving. The rain was heavy. I was tired. The truck ran the red light, but my reaction time was compromised. If I'd been more present, less consumed by my career, I might have... She trailed off. You might have still been in the exact same place at the exact same time, Bradford said firmly. Grace, you're constructing a narrative where your career killed your daughter. But that's not what happened. A truck driver ran a red light. That's what happened. Everything else is guilt trying to find a reason for the unreasonable. Maybe Grace conceded. But for 15 years, I haven't been able to separate those things. Every time I saw a piano, I saw Maya sitting next to me, her little hands trying to reach the keys. Every classical piece reminded me of her favorite composers. Every concert hall felt like the one we'd visited 2 days before she died. Music and loss became so intertwined that I couldn't experience one without the other. So you stopped completely, Mrs. Whitmore said. Grace nodded. Changed my name back to Holloway. I'd been using Holloway Chen professionally, my maiden name hyphenated with my married name. After Maya died, Richard and I couldn't survive the grief together. We divorced within a year. Everything connected to that life, the career, the marriage, the musician identity, I walked away from all of it. Found work that required no thought, no skill, no emotional investment. For 15 years, I've been hiding. Until tonight, Bradford said. Until tonight, Grace agreed. I came because today was Maya's birthday. I thought being near music would be enough. I thought I could just be in the same room with it, feel close to her memory, without actually participating. But then, she glanced toward where Celeste had been sitting earlier. Sometimes the universe gives you exactly the push you need, even if it comes from an unexpected direction. Are you glad you played? Mrs. Whitmore asked. Grace considered the question carefully. I don't know yet. Ask me tomorrow or next week. Right now I'm just tired, but also maybe the tiniest bit less heavy than I've been for 15 years. So that's something. Bradford leaned forward. Grace, I want to tell you something. What you played tonight, that Nocturne, it was transcendent. But more than that, it was honest. Every note contained the truth of what you've lived through. That's not something you can teach or fake. That comes from living, from surviving, from transforming pain into something that can touch others. Students need to learn that. The world needs to hear that. Grace met his eyes. I'm scared, Maestro. Scared that if I open this door again, I won't be able to control it. Scared that music will consume me the way it did before. Scared that... Her voice broke slightly. Scared that I'll be happy again, and that feeling happy will somehow be betraying Maya's memory. Oh, honey, Mrs. Whitmore said softly, reaching across the table to take Grace's hand. Maya wouldn't want you to spend your life in penance. Children want their parents to be happy. That's universal. If Maya were here, what would she want for you? Grace closed her eyes, and for the first time in 15 years, she let herself truly imagine that question. Maya at 22. Probably in college, maybe studying music, maybe having discovered some other passion entirely. She'd be independent, forming her own identity, living her own life. She'd want her mother to be doing the same. She'd want me to play. Grace whispered. She'd be furious that I stopped. She'd probably give me one of her lectures about not wasting my gifts. A ghost of a smile crossed Grace's face. She was very serious about not wasting things even at 7. She once cried because I threw away a perfectly good box that could have been used for art projects. Bradford laughed softly. She sounds wonderful. She was, Grace said simply. She really was. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of loss and possibility hanging equally in the air between them. Finally, Bradford spoke. You don't have to decide anything tonight, but Grace, at minimum, please start playing again. Get a piano. Let your hands remember what they know. Let music back into your life on your terms, not on a concert schedule or a recording contract. Just play. For Maya, for yourself, for everyone who needs beauty in the world. Grace looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll think about it, she said. I promise I'll really think about it. It was a small promise, but it felt momentous. Over the next several weeks, the video of Grace's performance went viral. Someone had posted their phone recording to social media with the caption, "Cleaning woman at charity event turns out to be legendary pianist," and within 48 hours it had been viewed millions of times. Classical music blogs picked up the story. Major news outlets ran features about Grace Holloway, the concert pianist who'd vanished from the music world and re-emerged 15 years later in the most unexpected way. The attention was overwhelming. Grace had to change her phone number twice and started wearing sunglasses and hats when running errands. But amid the chaos, something unexpected began to happen. Messages poured in from people who'd experienced loss, parents who'd lost children, musicians who'd quit their art after trauma, people who'd been hiding parts of themselves because grief had made authenticity feel too dangerous. They all shared versions of the same sentiment. Thank you for showing us that survival can include beauty. Thank you for proving that broken things can still create music. Grace read every message. Some made her cry. Some made her smile. All of them made her feel less alone. Celeste Beaumont, meanwhile, was experiencing her own transformation, though hers was far less comfortable. In the weeks following the recital, she became something of a cautionary tale on social media. Her cruelty to Grace had been captured on multiple phone recordings, and the internet had not been kind. Death threats appeared in her DMs. She was asked to step down from several charity boards. Former friends distanced themselves. For someone whose entire identity had been built on social status and public image, the fall was devastating. But Celeste made a choice. Instead of retreating into defensive explanations or hiring a PR firm to manage her image, she did something radical. She told the truth. She gave an interview to a local paper, acknowledging her cruelty without excuse. I was wrong, she said simply. I treated another human being as less than because I was insecure about my own worth. No explanation excuses that. I can only work to become better. And she did work. She volunteered at a homeless shelter, spending time with people she'd previously walked past without seeing. She took a job, her first actual job, working part-time at a music store, making minimum wage and learning what it felt like to earn rather than inherit. She started therapy, addressing the insecurities and entitlement that had shaped her cruelty. It wasn't glamorous, and social media didn't applaud her growth the way they'd condemned her cruelty. But Celeste kept at it anyway, understanding that transformation wasn't a performance, but a practice. 6 weeks after the recital, she wrote Grace a letter. Not an email or a text, but an actual handwritten letter on simple paper. Dear Grace, I don't expect you to respond to this, and I'm not writing to seek forgiveness. You've already given me more grace than I deserved that night. I wanted you to know that since the recital, I've been working to become someone different. Not because I'm trying to repair my public image, but because you showed me who I was, and I couldn't live with that person anymore. I've spent my whole life using money and status to avoid ever having to truly look at myself. But your music, your honesty, your courage to show up authentically, even in pain, it held up a mirror I couldn't avoid. I'm not good at being humble yet. I'm not good at seeing beyond my own privilege, but I'm trying. Every day I'm trying. Thank you for playing that night. Thank you for being brave enough to let us see your whole complicated, beautiful self. You gave me the gift of truth even though it was painful to receive. I hope wherever you are, whatever you decide about music, you're finding peace. With deep respect and gratitude, Celeste. Grace read the letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in her nightstand drawer. She didn't respond immediately, but she kept the letter. That felt important somehow, acknowledgement, without reconciliation, witness, without absolution. Some hurts took time to heal, and that was okay. Forgiveness. Grace was learning wasn't a switch you flipped, but a garden you tended. 6 months after the night at Rosewood Manor, Grace Holloway stood in a practice room at the Bradford Conservatory, listening to a 14-year-old student work through Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. The girl's technique was solid, but cautious. Each note played correctly, but without real feeling. Grace recognized the pattern fear of making mistakes was preventing genuine expression. "Stop," Grace said gently when the student finished the first movement. "That was very accurate, but tell me, what do you think this piece is about?" The student, a shy girl named Jennifer from a modest background on the conservatory's scholarship program, considered. "Sadness closer," Grace encouraged. "But what kind of sadness is it? The sadness of losing something, of wanting something you can't have, of remembering something beautiful that's gone?" These distinctions matter. Music without emotional specificity is just organized sound. Jennifer thought harder. Maybe the sadness of remembering something happy, because the melody is actually kind of beautiful even though it's in a minor key. Exactly. Grace smiled. Bittersweet. That's what Beethoven was capturing, the particular ache of remembering joy through the lens of loss. Now play it again, and this time let your hands tell that story. Don't just play the notes Beethoven wrote. Play the feeling he was trying to communicate. Jennifer's second attempt was markedly different, still tentative, but with glimpses of real emotional connection breaking through. When she finished, Grace said, "Better. Much better. You're starting to understand that technical perfection is just the foundation. The real music happens when you let your own experience inform the composer's intentions. You're allowed to bring yourself to the piece. In fact, you must." After Jennifer left, Grace sat alone in the practice room for a moment. Through the walls, she could hear other students working scales, arpeggios, fragments of concertos and sonatas. The building hummed with the sound of people learning to transform notation into art. She'd accepted Maestro Bradford's teaching position 3 months ago, starting small with just a handful of students. It had been terrifying at first, being back in this world surrounded by music, facing young people who looked at her with the same passion and hope she'd once felt. But it had also been healing in ways she hadn't anticipated. Teaching forced her to articulate things she'd only ever felt instinctively. Students asked questions that made her reconsider pieces she thought she knew completely. Their growth reminded her that music wasn't about perfection, but about connection, not about avoiding mistakes, but about transforming them into opportunities for expression. She'd bought a piano for her apartment, not a grand like the Steinway at Rosewood, but a good upright that fit her space and budget. Some nights she played for hours, working through pieces she'd abandoned 15 years ago. Other nights, she just sat at the bench, hands resting on the closed lid, breathing in the familiar smell of wood and polish and possibility. She'd given a small recital 2 months ago, her first public performance since that night at the charity gala. Just a modest event at the conservatory, mostly students and faculty in attendance. She'd played Chopin's Nocturne in C-sharp minor again, and this time she'd played it without crying. Progress, she'd learned, wasn't linear. Some days were harder than others. She still thought about Maya constantly, still wondered who her daughter would have become, still felt the particular ache of mother loss that never fully resolved. But she was learning to carry that grief differently, not as punishment or penance, but as part of her story, part of what made her the pianist and teacher she was now. On her desk at home, Grace kept 2 photographs side by side. One showed Maya, at age 7, grinning at the camera, gap-toothed and joyful. The other was from the conservatory's publicity materials, Grace at the piano, hands on the keys, eyes closed in concentration. She'd written something across the bottom of the second photo in permanent marker, "Still playing, baby girl. Always playing." Mrs. Whitmore had become a genuine friend, meeting Grace for lunch monthly and attending every one of her students' recitals. Maestro Bradford had become a mentor again this time, with the added dimension of 2 people who'd both lived long enough to understand that life's most important lessons often came through suffering. Even Celeste had re-entered Grace's orbit, though from a respectful distance. She'd endowed a scholarship at the conservatory in Maya's name, the Maya Holloway Chen Memorial Scholarship for students of limited financial means. She'd done it quietly, without publicity, and had asked Grace's permission first. Grace had said yes, understanding that Celeste's path to becoming better was her own to walk, and that Grace, the concept, not just her name, meant making space for people to transform. Now, sitting in the practice room as afternoon light filtered through the window, Grace placed her hands on the piano. She began to play not any particular piece, just improvising, letting her fingers explore melodies as they emerged. The music spoke of many things: loss and survival, grief and growth endings, and new beginnings. But mostly it spoke of continuity of love that transcended death, of gifts that demanded to be shared, of the stubborn human insistence on creating beauty, even from broken pieces. Somewhere Grace thought Maya was listening. Maybe not literally. Grace wasn't sure what she believed about afterlife, or spirits, or any of that. But in the way that mattered, Maya was present in every note Grace played, every student Grace taught, every moment when suffering was transformed into something that could touch another human heart. Talent, Grace had learned, wasn't about status or privilege or opportunity, though all those things helped. Talent was about being brave enough to show up as your whole self, scars and all, and offering that truth to others without apology. Worth wasn't something granted by social class or professional achievement. Worth was inherent, present in every person, regardless of their circumstances or choices. And sometimes, the greatest performance comes not from the loudest voice in the room, but from the quietest one, the voice that's been silent too long, finally given permission to sing. Grace's improvisation found its natural conclusion, the melody resolving into a major key ending on a note of hope rather than resolution. Because the truth was, her story wasn't over. This wasn't an ending, but a continuation of Maya's love of music, of Grace's own journey, of the infinite ways that broken things could still create beauty. She lifted her hands from the keys, let the final note fade into silence, and smiled. Then she stood, gathered her teaching materials, and headed to her next student's lesson. There was work to do, There was music to make. There was life to live. And for the first time in 15 years, Grace Holloway was ready for all of it.